In Warframe, there are several frames in the game currently that are still up for getting reworks, or at least deserve one. And Valkyr is in a weird spot, and she has been for quite some time now. She desperately needs a rework due to the fact that only 2 of her abilities are actually worth using, but at the same time, those 2 abilities she does have function extremely well and make her really powerful. So what we're left with is a frame that's kind of dysfunctional in her design, but still sits amongst the upper threshold of the best melee warframes in the game, competing with that of even Baruch. An exalted weapon that has been good for so many years despite the fact that regular melee weapons have often had the edge. Hysteria just seems to always survive, and it's gotten better sustainability over the years. And whilst Warcry is kind of reliant on its augment in order for it to be an excellent ability, having sort of any increased DPS ability that's based on speed, especially applied to your melee attacks, it's just guaranteed to be a good skill. And of course, having 2 bad abilities mean 1 slot can be used for a really good helmet, but I don't want to be that guy and start giving Warframes credit for having bad abilities just because the helmet system is that good. Ripline is completely useless, and it's because it's from an era of Warframe where parkour wasn't as good as it is now. Bullet jumps render this completely useless and kind of a meme ability. Sure, if you want to cosplay Scorpion from Mortal Kombat, you can do that, and I'm not here to dictate how much fun you can have, even with abilities that aren't conventionally effective, and I'm sure even die-hard fans of Valkyr will agree that her 2 and her 3 are horrendous. Her 3 especially just being a mild stun that costs you shields and energy to cast. If they were to rework Valkyr, I would love for them to make the ripline way better and actually work in some way, because it's at least a cool idea. However, I do hope they scrap the 3rd ability. So how good is Valkyr? She sits in a very similar spot to Atlas. By that I mean she's very simple in her design and playstyle, and that's because of her abilities that she's limited in how she can be played, but being a good melee warframe goes a long way within the game. And Valkyr's Hysteria is not a slouch of an exalted ability, having pure invulnerability with energy sustain that is now viable due to, of course, interactions with equilibrium and helmet. And there are multiple ways you can build this, but of course the most common would be slide attacks. Valkyr's slide attacks on Hysteria are absolutely monstrous, and they'll one-shot most content in the game. And of course you can spam the hell out of this because of the combination with Warcry. And if you don't feel like being completely immortal and being stuck using Hysteria and the claws, Valkyr is still viable as a melee warframe in general, because Warcry gives you even more armor to your already high value. So Warcry setup using other melee weapons. In this video you'll see that I'm using somewhat of a Leatherface setup, running around with a fucking chainsaw. I seriously love this ability. It isn't as good as Volt Speed, at least in terms of versatility, but having good attack speed and bonus armor is kind of dope. As for how I play my Valkyr, I have 2 main setups I want to cover today, and I really hope you try them, just because in my opinion it makes her exceedingly fun and should hopefully hold you out until they eventually announce a Valkyr rework. Fingers crossed. And for the first build I'm going to cover today, we're going to look at Hysteria. This Hysteria setup is focused around slide attacks and just running through hordes of enemies doing massive red crits, and Valkyr's Hysteria can do insane crit just at base, but my helmet option here is of course Wrathful Advance. Lover's Wrathful Advance gives you a massive crit bonus. Combine this with the fact that there's a decent amount of duration on this build, so you don't even have to really cast this that often. You have constant upkeep on your Warcry as well as your energy, and this is due to equilibrium and the KPM you're pumping out. You can see by the gameplay in the background, a Valkyr with a setup like this is just pretty much unstoppable. Having 2 good abilities at base, you think this Warframe would be completely worthless in the grand scheme of things. But like I mentioned at the start of the video, Baruch is already like highly regarded as one of the best melee exalted frames, because he can do this too, but I say Valkyr is almost neck and neck at the same skill. There are ways to make her combos do really solid damage overall and you not have to run around spamming slide, because I know it's not a playstyle everyone enjoys, but I'll be honest, I think it's because of my nostalgia from the Maiming Strike days that I actually still enjoy this setup. It's very simple in its playstyle, and if I ever want to run around, be immortal, fast, and see massive red numbers from my melee weapon, this is one of my go-to setups. Let's get into the build. So as for the Valkyr build, running Steel Charge and Aura for more melee damage, For our strength, we're running Blind Rage, Transient Fortitude, and Power Drift. This is going to give us a lot of damage as well as speed buff on our 2, and for our 2 we're also using it to augment Eternal War so its duration stays up permanently. To help with that negative efficiency, we're rocking Streamline, and then for our energy upkeep we're using Prime Flow and Equilibrium and Energize. Energize is going to help you be more comfortable with your energy, but if you don't have it, I know it's expensive, I'd probably recommend something like Arcane Strike for even more DPS and upkeep of KPM. Arcane Fury is huge on here, it's going to give a massive bonus to your damage, narrow-minded and prime continuity for our duration. And if you're worried about the negative range, don't worry, Raffle Advance is still versatile because you can hold down the ability just to dash forward. You won't go far, but you'll still get the crit buff. So negative range isn't going to affect the use that we're actually using this for, which is the crit buff. And here is the crit and high damage setup for our talons. We've gone for a large amount of viral damage, base damage, and of course crit with range. You could add a couple more form in here to fit in a Tennokai mod, but because we're spamming slide attacks, this isn't really necessary. And on both of these setups today, we'll be using Madurai, surprise surprise, so we can add Sling Strength to gain more strength, and then of course casting speed from power transfer. Valkyr is also really good when it comes to companion versatility and choices. If you don't feel like running viral on your claws, you can use the Panzervolper Filer, go with a crit buff from an Ardaza Kavat, and of course the grouping from the Nautilus is also extremely useful. These are the 3 I'd personally recommend, with Nautilus probably being my top pick. Of course, most of you guys are already familiar with that build. Hysteria Valkyr is insanely popular, at least amongst Valkyr mains anyway, and that's because it's efficient and it works. She's in such a weird spot, 2 neglected abilities but 2 really strong ones, kind of leaving her in a spot where she's still useful, but DE doesn't really have that drive to want to rework her just yet. I think this next build is kind of an example why she really needs one, because we're really just putting the focus on just her second ability. Warcry gives you a huge armor buff, slows enemies within its casting area, and increases your melee attack speed. Slow isn't important because it only works on the ability cast, but increasing your armor and your melee attack speed allows you to run some really fun melee setups, and one that I've been loving is using the Ghoul Saw. The Ghoul Saw is kind of a terrible melee weapon, but I can't help but try to use it on certain setups to make it work. And what we've done in this setup is choose a different helmet. In this case we've gone with a Phantom Eyes from Jade. This is not only going to give us that nice radial slow, which if anything the second ability is kind of missing at base because we can't recast this with or without the augment. So this is going to increase our survivability, but it also strips enemies armor over time. So on the Ghoul Saw, what we're trying to do is increase that DPS of its spinning saw blade via Warcry, strip enemies armor, and then use melee influence with blast damage to spread large amounts of blast procs everywhere on armor stripped enemies, which is what you're seeing in the gameplay in the background. This isn't an endgame setup because it's armor focused, so its survivability may be lacking, but in terms of just shredding down hordes of enemies in a room and seeing all of these procs going off, this build is so satisfying and it makes use of a weapon that isn't used by a lot of people. And like I said earlier, it's kind of Leatherface inspired. I really should be using that one skin from Valkyr that makes her look like she's covered in rags. But yeah, the playstyle is even more simple on here. We still keep Warcry active, but this time we're using a Phantom Eyes, and whenever we need a really big health heal, we can still use Hysteria and then get heals based off of our melee attacks with the claws, then proceed to exit the ability and get back to chainsawing. We're going with Still Charge and the Aura once again, but in our Exodus we're using Handspring because we're not going to be in our 4th ability too often, and this stacks with our passive. Only Blind Rage for strength this time around because we want more survivability. Eternal War once again. Archon Continuity is optional both with this and the previous build, simply because if you want to, you can run just Toxin on your claws, so that way you can proc Corrosive and Toxin, but sometimes I just prefer Viral. Umbral Fiber and Umbral Vitality for our survivability combined with Adaptation for DR. Stretch is going to help with our Phantom Eyes range, meaning that we can slow and strip enemies from further away. And Rage is completely optional here, it's just to make sure that we can cast our Phantom Eyes considering we're taking a lot of health damage, but due to Eternal War constantly being kept up, if we're killing enemies fast enough, you should have enough energy to cast a Phantom Eyes whenever you want. This is a flexi slot. However, our arcanes are extremely important here. I know Valkyr with her Warcry already has a lot of armor, especially with Umbral Fiber, but adding more via Guardian and then a little bit of self-healing and more armor from Reaper allows us to scale this build a little bit further, and this is where most of your health regen is going to be coming from as long as you're killing enemies with your Ghoul Saw. And we're going heavily status based on our Ghoul Saw here because it isn't that crit viable, especially without Raffle Advance. So going Blast Electricity with melee influence. Make sure you get a Tennokai mod in here, this is really important because those heavy attacks are going to help out a lot. and then a large amount of stats. Weeping Wounds is huge and combines really well with melee Elementalist. Range is also detrimental, and of course with all these elements we're proccing we want Condition Overload, but this is definitely interchangeable with Prime Pressure Point, and I would definitely recommend the Nautilus on this build just because that grouping is going to help spread the range and the damage of our melee influence, and our Madurai is the same as the previous. And that does it for today's Valkyr builds. Be sure to give them a go and let me know what you think. And also, do you think Valkyr still needs rework considering how she sits in a weird spot, a line between top tier melee frame but also one of the worst designed kits ever made? And she's been hard stuck like this for years now. Caliban is the next Warframe in line for a rework, and whilst I definitely think he deserves it more because his kit is probably less useful, I hope Valkyr is still in line for one because she is most definitely a one-trick pony. I think Valkyr would be pretty easy to rework / buff. Turn the first ability into some sort of grouping tool that pulls multiple enemies in at once, kind of like Sevagoth's Shadow's first ability. Great grouping tool is always useful. And then you have plenty of opportunities to do something unique with the third. I think giving Valkyr even more team support with this, maybe Paralysis could buff you and your teammates' melee range for an extended period of time. Like that's something we haven't seen yet. I don't know, I'm just spitballing here. Please give me your own ideas in the comments. I'm going to leave you guys with a bit more of the gameplay from some of the runs, and then I'll show you my Valkyr fashion at the end of the video. Hope you guys enjoyed, be sure to sub to the channel, follow me on Twitch, links are in the description, I'll see you next time.